We're going to finish up the unit on histology or tissues with this last lecture on muscle and nerve tissue. So to be clear, this is not any indication of the importance of these tissues, the fact that I'm cramming them in at the end and that they're both in the same lecture. I'm going to have an entire unit on the muscle tissue and 2 units on the nerve tissue. So for the sake of getting through this unit, I'm going to give you a very brief overview of muscle and nerve tissue. Connective tissue and epithelial tissue we went deep on. We hit all the different types of tissues, and I hope that you have a very good understanding of the differences between them and what their roles are in the body. For muscle and nerve tissue, for right now, we're going to just hit the basics, and then we're going to go deep on those when we get to those units. So let's get started. So muscle tissue is the 3rd type of tissue found in the human body. And there are actually 3 types of muscle tissue. And they have different structures and they have different jobs. So the first type of tissue that you're probably familiar with when I speak of muscle tissue is called skeletal muscle. What makes skeletal muscle unique in the sense of how the other tissues work is it's the only one that you can control. It is a voluntary tissue, meaning you control it with conscious effort. So skeletal muscles are the ones, if I were to say, give me an example of a muscle right now, you probably would be able to say biceps. You probably would say triceps. You might say pec major. You might say quads, right? These are all examples of skeletal muscle. What makes them unique in terms of the different types of muscle is they attach to bone, they attach to the skeleton, and you can control them. They're the only muscles in the human body that you can control. So let's talk about those now. First of all, what are they used for? They're used for movement. That's it. They have one job. Muscles are actually very simple in what they do. They're complex in how they work, but what they do is very simple. They have a certain length, right? So let's say this is the length of your muscle. They attach to 2 different bones. When you shorten that muscle fiber by making it contract, it gets shorter and the muscle moves the bone, and then when you relax it, it goes back. So for example, my bicep muscle, I know it's hard to see here, but my bicep muscle is attached here at my shoulder and it's attached here at my forearm. At this point, it's completely relaxed. If I want to make my arm move, I would simply contract my bicep muscle, which pulls my forearm forward, and that is contracted. And then when I relax it, it goes back to normal. So all your skeletal muscles are for is for movement. And that's not important. It's an extremely important part of your anatomy and physiology. What makes them unique? Well, if you take a look down here, you can see in this image, this is a microscope slide of skeletal muscle. One thing you'll note about it is that they are long and thin. They look like long tubes. They're actually extremely long. They're the entire length of the muscle. So one muscle cell is the length of the muscle. So for example, my bicep muscle, the cells that make up my bicep are this long. My quadricep are even longer. So they're long and they're thin. Now, what makes these muscles unique is they have multiple nuclei. What that means is, and if you take a look at this image here, this would be one cell, and it has many nuclei kind of pushed to the outside. Now, why are those nuclei pushed to the outside? Well, it's because they're full of proteins, and the proteins are what make the muscle move. So what ends up happening is, just like if you remember when we talked about adipose, when the adipose cell fills up with fat, it pushes the nucleus to the side. The same thing happens here. This would be an example of a muscle cell running this direction. Each of these muscle cells, each one of these tubes is a muscle cell, and they have multiple nuclei. And what that means is, this is important, these cells can't replicate. Your muscle cells cannot replicate. So if I were to cut, this is kind of gross, but if I were to take a big chunk of my muscle out, let's say I got in an accident and a big chunk of my bicep got removed, it will never grow back. It doesn't heal like other types of tissues. It doesn't have the ability to because there's a bunch of individual cells fused together to make your skeletal muscle. They are striated. What striated means, if you take a look here, you can see it goes light, dark, light, dark, light, dark. That is because your muscles work like an accordion, where they get smaller and then they increase in size. And where that happens, those are going to have striations. So for now, you just need to know that striations is the difference in light, dark, and what it does is it allows for movement. These are long and thin, and they have multiple nuclei. The second type of muscle fiber, let me move my head here. The second type of muscle fiber are going to be smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is very different from skeletal muscle. It is not voluntary. What that means is you can't control it. And this is the muscle that you're going to find in your digestive tract. you're going to find this muscle around your blood vessels. Remember I talked about your dermal blood vessels that will get larger and smaller depending on the temperature? That is smooth muscle. It's also the muscle that you're going to find in your organs. All of your organs are going to be having smooth muscle in there. And these are muscles that we cannot control. You cannot make food push through your intestines, right? It just happens. You cannot make your muscle contract and push food out. You cannot make your blood vessels get larger and smaller. Those are all done involuntarily. They do not have striations. They're actually smaller cells. They have kind of a teardrop shape, and each one has a single nuclei. These can replicate. So this type of tissue can replicate. And then finally, we have our cardiac muscle. And our cardiac muscle is only found in one place, and that is our heart. That's why it's called cardiac muscle. It is striated like your skeletal muscle. So it works a lot like the skeletal muscle, but there's a couple big differences between them. For one thing, it is involuntary. You cannot control your heart muscle. That is a good thing. If I tell you guys, all right, everybody make your heart stop now, you can't do it. And that's because it is involuntary. The only muscles you can control are your skeletal muscles, the ones that attach to the bone that make the bone move when you want them to. Smooth muscle you cannot control. Cardiac muscle you cannot control. So I just want to do now is I just want to show you a little bit of a difference between the skeletal muscle and the cardiac muscle, because they're actually very similar, but they do have a couple big differences. So let's talk about skeletal muscle first. The fibers run in one direction, and they have striations, which mean that they go light, dark, light, dark, light, dark. Now, again, I'm going to explain that better when we get to the muscle unit. For right now, just know that they have striations. They attach to 2 points, one at each side, and it's a straight line that goes in those directions. So what happens is when this muscle gets shorter, it pulls one side to the other side. The nuclei are pushed to the outside because of all these muscle fibers, right? The protein, you guys know this if you exercise. One of the things you need to take if you want to build muscle is protein. And that's because this muscle is actually made out of protein. So this would be a skeletal muscle. Your cardiac muscle looks similar, but it's got some major differences. First off, it branches. And what that does is it allows for a much more complex structure. Think about what the heart looks like. It's got all these openings and it's got rooms in it, and that's because it branches. Another big difference is these are one nucleus per. So this would be a single cardiac muscle cell. This would be a single cardiac muscle cell. And what they have is they have these little doors, essentially. They have these little things called intercalated discs. And intercalated discs are unique to cardiac muscle. And what they do is they are gap junctions. What that does is it allows one muscle fiber to trigger the next muscle fiber. And it's extremely important. One thing that your heart does, which is unbelievably impressive, is it's made up of millions of little tiny cells. And somehow our body's able to make all those muscle cells contract at once. If I said, all right, everybody on the count of 3, clap your hands. 1, 2, 3. What are the chances that everybody's going to clap at the same time? It's not going to happen. Some people are going to be early, some people are going to be late. But somehow our heart is able to maintain a steady beat, lubbed up, 60, 80 times a minute, every minute of your life, right? And the reason why it's able to do that is because of these little intercalated discs. What it does is it allows one muscle fiber to trigger the next muscle fiber, so the entire heart can beat as one unit. So let's go into that with a little more detail. So cardiac muscle is going to be striated. It's only going to be in the heart. The intercellular junction is going to be called an intercalated disc, and that is a gap junction. And what it does is it allows for the heart to contract as one unit. It is involuntary. You can't control your heart, and it beats in rhythm, and it's able to do that because of these intercalated discs, which are extremely important. So if you look at this diagram down here, this image of cardiac fiber, you can see these are the muscle fibers, those are the nuclei, and these little lines here, those are those intercalated discs that allow the muscles to contract together. I like this little diagram on this next slide. This guy's awesome. He's just chilling, and he's got his skeletal muscle here, so you can see the fibers are all running in one direction, and they have the striations, and this is going to be voluntary. This is your cardiac muscle. They look almost the same. The difference is they have these intercalated discs, and they have a single nucleus per fiber. And then finally we have our smooth muscle, which looks nothing like the other two. It's very weak. It's not a strong muscle. It has a slow contraction, which we'll talk about later. It is a single nuclei per, and it is something that is involuntary. So skeletal is voluntary, cardiac and smooth are involuntary. On the next couple slides, you'll just see some pictures. This is smooth muscle, so you can see an individual muscle cell here, an individual muscle cell here. This is going to be skeletal muscle. These fibers are all running the same direction. I don't know if you can see it, but you can. If you can really take a look at this, you can see it goes dark, light, dark, light. It's got these bands. That's the striations that I was talking about. And the nucleus is going to be crammed to the outside. And then finally, we have our cardiac muscle. You can see here the nuclei are inside the different fibers, and then there's these intercalated discs. So there's a disc here, there's a disc here. And now we're going to finish up with the nervous tissue. Nervous tissue, there's a lot to say about it, but for today we're just going to go with the very basics. This is going to be found in your brain, spinal cord, and your peripheral nerves. Your peripheral nerves leave your spinal cord and go out to your body. The main cell involved in this type of tissue is called a neuron. So a neuron is going to be the cell which makes up your nervous tissue, but it's not the only type of cell. There's a secondary type of cell called neuroglial cells, and we're going to talk more about those later. But neuroglial cells are also very important. What does a neuron do? All the neuron is, it's a super complicated cell. There's no doubt about it. We're going to spend some time talking about it. But it really only has one job. It sends information from one part of the body to the other. So it's about as complicated as a telephone. You call someone up, you tell them what to do, they do it. That is what a neuron does. It takes information from one part of the body and sends it to the other part. It uses electrical impulses, called nervous impulses, to do so, and they're always going to attach to one of three things. They either attach to another neuron, they attach to a muscle, or they attach to a gland. And their job is they send information to either trigger a response or process information. The neuroglial cells are the support cells. They make the neurons work. So in this next slide, you can see really what's going on. This is a neuron. This big guy here is a neuron. There's 3 neurons in this image. But you can see these little cells over here. See these little cells over here? Those are the neuroglial cells. If you remove the neuroglial cells, the neurons don't work. So they're very important. Here's the analogy I have for that. Theater. Think of going to a play. When you go see a play, you see the actors on the stage, right? The actors are putting on the show. Think of the neurons as the actors. But if you know anything about theater, there's a lighting crew, there's a set crew, there's a costume crew, there's a sound crew, and all those people are making the actors be able to do their jobs. They turn the lights on and control the lights. They get the costumes together. If you take away any of those crews, the play can't go on, right? So think of the neurons as the main, as the actors here, but the neuroglial cells are the support cells that help that neuron do its job. So we're going to go into great detail on this stuff, but for right now, you just need to know the neuron is the main cell that does the job, and the neuroglial cells are what we call support cells. They're glial cells. They help the neurons do their job, and if you take them away, the neurons don't work. Thank you.